Welcome back, dear friends. We are discussing some concepts related to carbon footprint, carbon budget, and climate justice. In the last lecture, we had seen how important it is to capture the carbon footprint of an individual or of a nation. And in this session, we would learn another interesting concept by the name carbon budget. So the objective is to understand carbon budget. So what is carbon budget? In the context of climate change, this term has got a significant meaning, and we would be defining it as a total amount of greenhouse gases that are generated by we the human beings. And not only generated, but they are accumulated at a given point of time in the atmosphere. So what is today's carbon budget is what is the total amount of greenhouse gases which are generated today and accumulated today in the atmosphere, and which are allowable. So budget is not that we can have an infinite amount of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because we have already seen that there is a finite limit to what the atmosphere can absorb, how much the atmosphere can absorb without a corresponding rise in temperature. Okay, so we important point in the definition of carbon budget is not only that it is the total amount of greenhouse gases which are accumulated in the atmosphere, but also how much of those are allowable. Okay, so why are we interested in accumulated? Because we had already seen that the greenhouse gases, namely carbon dioxide or methane or nitrous oxide and so on, they have certain lifetime, and hence they remain in the atmosphere far longer than an annual period. Okay, so we need to consider the emissions accumulated over the lifetime. And why do we talk of budget? We talk of the budget because as like financial budget, it hints at the finite capacity to spend. Okay, in this case, we are talking about expenditure, we are talking about emissions, right? So if you define a carbon budget, if you say that this is a carbon budget, it means that only so much of the carbon can be emitted into the atmosphere without catastrophic climate change. So that is the meaning. Okay, so budgeting, financial budgeting would hint at the finite capacity, how much the government can spend. If you are talking about a union budget of a government, how much the government can spend, okay, within its resource constraints. Similarly, how much one can emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases within the allowable constraints of the climate change. So that is the meaning of carbon budget. Okay. More present expenses would mean less budget for the future expenses. Similarly, more emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouses today would mean less carbon dioxide we can emit in the future. Okay, so that is the analogy. More present expenses, financial expenses, would mean less budget for future expenses. Similarly, more carbon dioxide emissions today would mean less carbon dioxide budget for future expenses, future emissions. So carbon budget is constructed to focus on the share of different countries in the total allowable carbon dioxide emissions or total greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I would emphasize on the point allowable. So total allowable means what? In the present context of the climate change negotiations which are happening, total allowable would mean, let us say, to keep the average global temperatures within the threshold temperature. Now, threshold temperature would be 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level, or it could be 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. Okay, In other words, it would mean that if we are setting a target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then the corresponding carbon budget would be less. It means that we cannot emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere if you want the CO2 levels to be in a manner such that the temperature does not rise 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels. If instead we talk about 2 degrees centigrade as the threshold temperature, then the carbon budget for 2 degrees centigrade would be a larger budget than the say 1.5 degrees centigrade. So this is the meaning of carbon budget. So budget is constructed to focus on the allowable carbon dioxide emissions or the allowable total greenhouse gas emissions, and it also gives us an idea about what is the share of different countries in the total carbon dioxide emissions which are allowable. Okay. Now one assumption, why are we talking about emissions and temperature? Why are we linking the two? Why are we saying that if the temperature is 2 degrees centigrade, our allowable temperature is 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial level, why do we say that the carbon budget is more? And if it is less, 1.5 degrees centigrade, why the carbon budget is less? It means that we are assuming a linear relationship between the rising temperature and accumulated atmospheric carbon dioxide. Is this true? Not necessarily that the relationship is linear, but then there is some relation. And this has been brought out by the different reports, IPCC reports, which link the anthropogenic emissions with the climate change, and it also talks about a certain concrete relationship between rising temperature and accumulated atmospheric carbon dioxide. So though the relation is not exactly linear, but there is a relationship. And then why are we talking about the two? Why are we clubbing the temperature with the carbon budget? The reason is because when you are doing it this way, if you are linking the temperature with the carbon budget, then it gives us a useful tool for negotiations, climate change negotiations. So carbon budgeting would remain a useful tool for policymakers during climate change negotiations. So that is the relevance of defining what is a carbon budget and understanding what is a carbon budget. Now, how much is the carbon budget? So we need to refer to the reports which are published occasionally by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So as per the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a premier body of United Nations which is studying climate change, and which comes out with occasional assessment reports, in one of its reports, which was published in 2014, it says that the carbon budget for the entire world, if the threshold temperature is kept as 1.5 degrees centigrades, is 2,250 gigatons of CO2. Right? And this budget is for the period 1861 up to 2100. It means that the total allowable carbon dioxide emissions up to 2100 from 1861 is around 2,250 gigatons of CO2. Right? And what is the meaning of this? This means that the world as a whole can emit only 2,250 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 1861 onwards up to 2100, that is in a span of about 240 years, to stay within the temperature level of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. So that is the meaning. So what is the budget then? What is the carbon budget then? In 1861, what was the carbon budget? Up to 2100, the total carbon budget was 2,250 gigatons of CO2. Okay. Now this estimate is made by assuming certain probability. So the figure which we are talking about, 2,250 gigatons per CO2, this has been arrived at 66% probability. Okay. Because it's science, so we cannot say anything for sure, but we can make a statement at certain degree of confidence. So at a 66% degree of confidence or 66% probability, we can assume that the total carbon budget in 1861 was 2250 gigatons of CO2. Now, as per the studies and as per after calculating the carbon footprint of different nations, it was found that we means the human beings, okay, the total planet has exhausted all of its budget but for 400 gigatons of CO2. So only 400 gigatons of CO2 has remained. All the carbon budget has now been exhausted. Okay, so from 2020 onwards, the carbon budget is now only 400 gigatons of CO2. What does this mean? So it means that world now can emit only 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 2020 onwards for a 66% chance to stay within the temperature level of 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. Okay, so are you getting the point? Only 400 gigatons of CO2 is the carbon budget to stay within the temperature level of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. Okay, the point is then we need to ask who has used up the balanced budget, who has used up this 1850 carbon budget. As the world, we have exhausted 1850 gigatons of carbon budget. Okay, but who has used that carbon budget? That is a relevant question to be asked, which we would be discussing in the next class. Okay, so we would then look into the carbon budget of different countries. I hope that you have understood the very interesting concept of carbon budget. In the next lecture, we would see as to how these figures of the carbon budgets give us a thorough insight into the climate change negotiations. Okay, thank you very much. Bye for now.